Hi, I'm Andy Pringle, the Political and Strategic Campaigns Director from March On, and I'm excited to see everyone joining us tonight for part 3 of Pushing for Progress, a 3-part panel series from March On and SEIU. This panel series is dedicated to learning from the lessons of 2020 and planning for 2022 and beyond, with 3 events focused on pivotal states. 2 weeks ago in Georgia, which flipped blue in a big way and gave Democrats control of the Senate. Last week in Florida, where Democrats underperformed expectations, and tonight, Texas, where on-the-ground infrastructure building could make the state the next one to flip. Before I hand it over to our moderator for our first conversation, you can join us in tweeting out highlights with the hashtag Pushing for Progress. And please put your questions for the panelists in the Q&A box. Next, I'd like to thank some people who made this panel series possible and worked around the clock to help make the wins of 2020 possible. Vanessa Rubel, March On's Executive Director, Penelope Chester, March On's Chief Operations Officer, Chris Smith, March On's National Campaigns Director, Zach Cruz, March On's Texas State Director, and last but absolutely not least, Kairu Crimes, Black Civic Engagement Lead at SEIU. That's our dream team who made things happen in 2020, but we need you on our dream team for 2022. That's why we're asking everyone in attendance tonight to pledge to register 5 people to vote between now and the next election. You can do that at wearemarchon.org/pledge. Now let's get to it. Texas has had quite a year already. In January, Texas Senator Ted Cruz objected to the certification of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as winners of the presidential election, and 15 Texas House members supported the objection. Then in February, the state experienced a historic snap of cold weather that left millions without power, heat, and water for days, and left 111 people dead. The Republican governor and other elected officials like Senator Ted Cruz ignited fury for their slow or in some cases non-existent response. But back in 2020, Texas carried some high expectations. It's home to 38 electoral votes, yet it hasn't gone blue in a presidential election since 1976. Still, the margins have been getting tighter and tighter over the last few cycles. Barack Obama lost in 2012 by 12 points. Hillary Clinton lost in 2016 by 9 points. Beto O'Rourke lost his Senate race by just 3 points in 2018, and Joe Biden lost by just under 6 points in 2020. The good news is that Joe Biden received more votes than any Democratic nominee has ever gotten in Texas. But the bad news is that Donald Trump got more votes than any Republican has ever gotten too. After Beto's narrow loss, Democrats felt they had a shot at flipping the state for Biden, maybe even unseating Senator John Cornyn and definitely winning some state races, but none of it happened. Electoral politics is a long game, but a lot of Texas progressives were left frustrated because we know that midterms will be even tougher. But as Beto O'Rourke said, Texas isn't a red state, it's a non-voting state. It's estimated that there are 2 million solidly Democratic unregistered voters in the state. Voters Democrats need if they're going to close the gap with the Republicans and get ahead in the registration race. So we have a lot to talk about. Tonight we have a special treat, 2 panels, one to provide some perspective on national investment at the state level, and one with the people on the ground in Texas. To get us started with our first panel, I'm honored to introduce our first moderator, Jamal Watkins, Senior Vice President of Strategy and Advancement at the NAACP. Jamal, take it away.
Thank you, Andy, the Dream Team, March On, SEIU, and everyone for tuning in to this important conversation. Now, you know that there is a change afoot when you have 2 powerhouse leaders who are hard to get in one place at the same time available. And so we're going to start this conversation from a national perspective with Derrick Johnson, who serves as the national president and CEO of the NAACP, and President Lee Saunders of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. Now, I want to be clear that as we have this conversation, we know that there are local leaders in Texas who are making sure that we get it right. So I know that Dorothy Townsend is probably watching to make sure the team AFSCME is really getting it right, as well as President Gary Bledsoe of the NAACP Texas State Conference. So as we jump into this first question, President Johnson and President Saunders, Andy lifted up the importance of Texas's electoral votes. It's second only to California. And we know that these are high stakes. And as she said, Texas isn't a red state, it's a non-voting state. And so each of the organizations, AFSCME and NAACP, have made decisions around elections every cycle. And so if the problem is turning Texas from a non-voting state into a state with high turnout, why isn't more time and money put into voter registration in the state of Texas?
Well, I can start, Jamal. First of all, thank you and Andy. The way you all lead in, it generates energy. I was sleeping and Andy started talking and you came behind it and woke me up. Texas is a big state. Really, in Texas, you're talking about an 8-city strategy. I attended law school in Texas. And I tell you, the cash infusion to really do what's needed in Texas isn't a one transaction reality. It's a multi-year, very focused, cash intensive proposition. But I think it's worth it. I think we have hit that tipping point. What North Carolina showed us in 2008, what Georgia proved in 2018, and then we were able to stop the theft of in 2020, is the realization for Texas. Texas is the opportunity for us to close the door on this protracted argument about the role of government and tax policy. The number of delegates that come out of Texas truly will shift this country to begin to look forward and to allow for a more inclusive political landscape. Unfortunately, the politics of fear, the politics of race, the politics of morality have so dominated the landscape that it gave fuel to what we see in January 6th. And that fuel was a result of the movement that we formerly called the conservative movement, now the insurrectionist movement. They're running out of voters. But our movement, we are gaining voters all across the southern landscape, from Texas all across to Virginia. You're seeing the blackening and browning and the openness of America. And because of that, Texas must be in play moving forward.
I will add, Jamal, and good seeing you again. And I'm always happy to be with my brother, Derek Johnson. We work very, very closely together all across the country, have a great relationship. The first thing that I believe that we've got to do is recognize that Texas is a work in progress. Nothing is going to happen magically overnight. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of resources, and it's going to take a lot of dedication and commitment from those who are working in Texas to get the job done. Look, we've got to continue voter registration drives year round. We cannot just do that 2 or 3 weeks out of the year. We've got to continue to mobilize and educate our communities every single day. We've learned something within the labor movement, and that is that in order for you to have a structure in place, a political structure in place that is going to make significant change, you cannot parachute people in a month or 2 before the election, and then they leave right after the election. You've got to have a year-round program working with existing groups within Texas, within the states across the country, organizing and mobilizing and educating our communities. So the stuff about going in for a quick second and then leaving, that's not going to get what we need. That's not going to get us to where we have to be in Texas. We've got to have a year-round program, and we are committed to working with organizations like the NAACP and other labor unions and other progressive organizations to make sure that we have that year-round program and they have the resources necessary to educate and mobilize every single day. So we're going to continue to do that. And you've got some existing organizations in Texas that are doing some great things. And I'm just going to name a few. I'll probably get some folks angry because I haven't mentioned them, but Move Texas, Texas Organizing Project, the Texas Civil Rights Project, all of those organizations are on the ground in Texas doing the work that needs to be done every single day. And we are partnering with them at the national level to make sure that they have the resources to get that job done. So we're excited about what could possibly happen. Is it going to change tomorrow? No, that's why you've got to continue to plant that seed, continue to talk with your community leaders, talk with communities, young, old, communities of color, and make sure that number one, we're registering voters, but secondly, engaging them in the politics of the state and engaging them in the issues that they care about, not only in Texas, but across the country.
You know, those insights are really important. And one of the questions that keeps coming up is when you look at Georgia or Florida or North Carolina, states that are making progress, not all have gotten there. But then you look at Arizona, another state with a large Latino population that has made tremendous gains. What is it about Texas that has prevented it from making those same types of gains? What's missing or what's happening that's preventing it from really getting to the next wave of, you know, turnout and voter engagement, et cetera?
Texas is a very diverse state, and you have a lot of first-generation citizens, not non-citizens, citizens there. Secondly, you, unlike any other state, except California, you cannot look at Texas as a monolith. It is, I go back, it's a big state. You know, I used to drive from Mississippi to Houston, and there's this stretch right on the Louisiana-Texas border in Orange County. It feels as if it takes an eternity to get to Beaumont because it's such a large state. And so when you look at it, you really, like, go back, you're looking at 8 cities where the opportunity exists, but recognizing that you have a lot of individuals who are first-generation citizens. You have a lot of individuals who are migrating into Texas, so you have to get them politically socialized. And you have a lot of organizations that what we have to work with as much as possible to get them networked so they can begin to look at a systematic approach to make Texas voting population reflect the true demographics, need, and interests of that state.
I think Derek's exactly right. I think this is, you can't compare Texas with Arizona. I don't think you can compare Texas with Georgia or North Carolina. It's a different kind of state. It's huge. I mean, it's a huge state geographically. I mean, let me just throw out some statistics so people really understand. Texas has 4 times the number of people as Arizona. That's number one, if we're comparing it to Arizona. It's home to 4 of the nation's 11 largest cities. Texas is home to, has 4 of the largest cities in this country, with major population centers hundreds of miles apart. They aren't close together. In Arizona, by contrast, you have Arizonians who live in 2 major counties in that state, which are about an hour-and-a-half drive from each other. So it's different in that state. Plus, you have a Latino community in Texas, which is, I believe, different from the Latino community in Arizona, and we've got to take that into consideration. And just within Texas, it's a mistake to assume that the Latino vote is monolithic. It is not. It is not, and you've got to make those necessary adjustments. A Latino family in Bullock or in Lubbock is going to have a different kind of outlook than those in Dallas or Houston or El Paso or even Corpus Christi. So you've got to take that into consideration, and that's why it's so important that you have boots on the ground and you're working with those organizations in those respective communities, because they understand. They understand the geographics, they understand the politics of those communities and the differences that exist within cities across that state. So it's a big endeavor. I mean, but we can do this, and we're we're moving that needle closer and closer and closer. I mean, you saw it in the national elections. I mean, and you're seeing it where we're attracting more people. We're talking to more folks. We're registering them to vote, but we're keeping it in the communities and with the people who they know and who care about those local issues. I mean, and that's where you've got to start off. And people have got to see that they can make a difference at the local level. And then you just bring them on, man. You just bring them on and continue to educate and talk about the local issues and the national issues, and then talk about the importance of everyone coming together around supporting the needs of their communities in the state of Texas.
And I like how you framed the local and the national issues. The last question that I know has been bubbling is we are digging ourselves out of COVID-19. It's a global pandemic that has had devastating local impacts, but we also saw last year extrajudicial killings that led to racial tensions and uprisings. The trial for the murder of George Floyd is currently underway. I wonder if each of you could share your thoughts on what, the George Floyd murder, the backdrop of COVID-19, what does all of this mean in terms of the impact on how we organize today?
I think how we organize today, we have to speak to the opportunities, the concerns, the interests of communities that we're talking to. I come from a training that says that an expert is someone who knows a little bit more than everybody else in the room. So when we go into communities, we have to learn from the expertise of the local people who live in the community and hear what they are concerned about so that we can develop communications and talking points as relate to them and ensure that what we are seeking in terms of outcome will meet those needs and interests. That's why, his strategies become important in this conversation, having focus groups that are so localized so that we can speak to the needs and interests of the target population when we're talking about getting people engaged civically.
It really is heartbreaking. I was born, and I won't tell you what year, but I was born in the 50s, okay? And I remember, and I was born in Cleveland, Ohio. My dad was a bus driver, worked for the city of Cleveland as a bus driver. My mom was a community organizer in Cleveland. And they constantly told my brother and me that we had to be involved. They would drag us to meetings all over the city to see Dr. King and other famous leaders. Not that we necessarily wanted to go, but they knew that it was important that we be there. So we understood the challenges that confronted us, not only in the city of Cleveland, but across the country. I remember my father having discussions with me and my brother, having that talk with us, and you know what I'm talking about, about what reality is and how you've got to deal in the environment and be careful. And be careful what you do, be careful what you say. And I had to have that same kind of talk with my two sons. I mean, in the 1980s, okay? And unfortunately, my two sons have got to have conversations with their sons. I've got 3 grandsons right now. The same conversations that my father had with me about being careful. I mean, and the table that you sit at is not the same table that other folks sit at. And we've got to make sure, and that's why it's so important. And I wanted to tell that story because working for a union and being president of a major union across the country, 1.4 million members, we have all kinds of members within our union. We have conservatives, we have progressives, we have liberals, we have Republicans, we have Democrats. I mean, we cover the whole spectrum. But we have the ability and the opportunity to bring people together to talk about the challenges that confront all of us. And they can be very difficult discussions. But we have that opportunity to talk about those challenges. And all of us, I believe, have a responsibility to link economic justice with racial justice, with labor rights, with human rights, and with civil rights. All of those are connected in some kind of way. And all of us have a responsibility to put those issues on the table and not run from the problem, but deal with the issue. We're dealing with some very, very serious issues in this country that have been brought forth in a very tragic way the past 4 years. And we've got to come together and talk about those issues and deal with them. It breaks my heart when I am looking at the trial going on in Minnesota right now. I mean, and hearing the testimony and watching the tears of people that saw what happened and knowing that it is wrong. Yet you have people that believe that that's really, there's no problem there. I mean, there's nothing that was bad that happened there. I mean, we've got to change that mentality in some kind of way. And I know Derek deals with this every single day. I mean, he's a spokesperson. He's a leader in dealing with this crisis. But all of us have a responsibility to deal with this in one way or another. And as the president of the union and being a part of the labor movement, I'm telling you, we've got to deal with it, and we are dealing with it and working very closely with the NAACP and our partners across the country, identify the problem, come up with the solutions, move this country forward.
Ladies and gentlemen, President Derek Johnson of the NAACP, President Lee Saunders of the mighty labor union AFSCME. I know this is a lot of good learning, and we probably want to keep going and keep talking, but we're going to now pivot because we want to hear some perspectives from those on the ground in Texas. But note that we are all standing together and committed to fighting forward in a way that's going to make life better, not only for the folks in Texas, but for every single state in this union, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, moving us forward in the right ways. So now it is time to introduce the moderator of our next panel, Mr. James Michael Russell. James is a freelance journalist who covers politics and all things Texas for publications like the Quorum Report, Art and Culture Texas, Dallas Voice, D Magazine, Fort Worth Weekly. I know y'all are reading the Fort Worth Weekly, Texas Jewish Post, and more. So please welcome James Michael Russell, who will moderate the next conversation.
Thank you, Jamal. And for future reference, I will personally send you a physical copy every week of the Fort Worth Weekly, should you desire to read anything. You can also check it out online, fwweekly.com. Anyway, thank you, Jamal, seriously. And this is a fantastic conversation. I want to also thank March On and the SEIU for having me here. And I'm really excited to be a part of this panel. I cover elections for a living, so this hits pretty close to home. But before we dive into our panel with Texas activists and leaders, we just have a quick video we want to share about what happened in Georgia.
What does it sound like when thousands of voices are heard for the first time? What does it look like when hundreds of young people take on a historic fight? What happens when we unmute a generation? Victory happens. Change happens. We took a groundswell years in the making and added our mark. We helped elect the first Black senator in Georgia's history and the first millennial senator, period. We rallied 20 partners on the ground, on the phone, and across the country. We covered 1,200 miles, visiting 14 cities. We got the word out with over 1,500 posters, 10 billboards, and digital and TV ads that were seen by millions. We hosted 12 live events and a megawatt drive-in concert. We gathered 600 volunteers and sent 1 million tags to get over 350,000 voters to the polls. We knocked on thousands of doors, and after all that, it worked. What happened when our country needed us? We stepped up. Thank you.
Power to the people, right on.
And I think that's what the following activists want to see happen in Texas. I want to present our slate of activists and leaders, and they are Amanda Edwards, President and CEO of the community-based solutions firm; Candace Valenzuela, Texas State Chair of Vote Mama, which supports Democratic mothers with young children as they run for office; Ed Espinoza, Executive Director of Progress Texas; Kendall Scudder, Co-Chair of Represent Texas PAC; Ray Martinez, Senior Director of Texas Writing; and Travis Dupree, National Partner Coordinator at the SEIU. So I'm gonna first start with a question for the group. And I also want to set one limitation, that because we have a lot of awesome people on here who have a lot of awesome things to say, you also need to be limited to the a time period. And I suggest 2 minutes, and I will time you. So Democrats had a lot of high expectations going into Election Day. And Andy mentioned that Biden lost, Cornyn held a seat, Democrats failed to even make a dent in the Texas House. So when I call on each of you, I'd like to share how you feel today about the state of affairs for Democrats in Texas and answer the fundamental question at the heart of this panel. Is Texas the next Georgia? Ed, you had the most optimistic takes on the election results. So I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, and I'll try and keep it brief.
We will keep it brief.
But I'll be honest. The day after the election, the night of the election, it was as tough for me as it was for anybody else. But what I also wanted to do is I thought it was very important to acknowledge the strength of the movement and what we had accomplished. And while we didn't flip the House, it's really important to remember that in Texas, we had flipped 12 seats in 2018, 19 seats since the 2014 election. And in the 2020 election, we held all of those gains. Now, that may not sound like much, but holding 19 seats, even the 12 seats in the previous election, that is a big feat in any state that you're in, but especially for Democrats and progressives in Texas. So I thought that that was very important. The swing counties, the suburban counties, this has been a place where conservatives have really maintained strength over the past decade, maybe the past 2 decades. Democrats cut into that base and flipped the majority of those counties. Now, the difference, the real difference was that Republicans were able to run up the score in those rural areas. They got more votes in some of those areas than I even thought was possible. Now, what that tells us is that a lot of times persuasion is important, but base mobilization is important too. It's not either or, it is both. And in this case, we focused a lot on the persuasion. We may have made a tactical error in not going door to door during COVID. I still think it was the right one. We put health and safety first. But look, the bottom line is we made progress in Texas and we protected it. We still have work to do.
Hey, thanks, Ed. Ray, you're next.
So, although we did see some disappointing results from the 2020 election, I will say there was a silver lining in the way young people turned out, and specifically young people of color, which is the constituency that I work with at Texas Rising. So I think that, that gives me a lot of hope for Texas, a lot of hope for Texas moving forward. And just to also give an anecdote, my family, I come from a non-voting family, which has changed over the years. And that's changed because in 2014, I was invested in as a young person in the state. I was taught how to organize. And then I talked to my family about what was happening, when they were, when they should vote, if they need to get registered to vote. So I think that, my family over time has turned into a snowstorm voters, and they go out every election and we talk about every election together. And I think that a lot of Texas is starting to see these slow changes happening. And so I have a lot of faith in Texas as we move forward. So yeah, that's my take.
Awesome. Amanda, you're up.
Yes, I think that, of course, there were high hopes set for 2020 and the cycle, and certainly there was a lot of enthusiasm. We were coming off the 18 cycle in which Beto had gotten within 215,000 votes of flipping the state at a time when nobody thought that that was going to happen. And certainly we knew that when you have Trump at the top of the ticket, there certainly could be some element of surprise. I think maybe Democrats believe the surprise would go in the opposite direction, which is that, exciting gains. And I think there were lessons in that context, which is there's a long-term game at stake. And so you may take one big bite at the apple and not be successful, but we have to keep biting and we have to keep trying, just as we saw happen in Georgia. Stacey Abrams and the work that she has done was work over time. It was not just a one-time phenom. It was circumstances where the groundwork has to be laid. And so we have to be vigilant, remain engaged and encouraged. I, for one, bought into the 2020 cycle being one where there would be radical change because I ran for U.S. Senate. I gave up my council seat to do it. And so I certainly believe in the promise that is Texas. I just think that we have a little more work to do, and we've got to be encouraged and continue to be consistent with the work that is to be done. And that is ongoing throughout the year and not just in the election year specifically.
Travis, give me your best take.
Thanks. And I don't want to repeat what others have said, but I've had the opportunity to speak with fast food workers, healthcare workers, airport workers in Texas prior to the election, and was pleasantly surprised with the optimism of what was possible before the election. And following the election, having the opportunity to speak with folk and them believing that change could happen, right? Believing that if we support the existing infrastructure, we can build something sustainable. Like Sister Amanda just said, like literally, we're on the verge of making sea change, not just in Texas, but throughout the South, and just want to figure out how we could support what's already happening there, right? Like not recreating the wheel, but support the existing infrastructure, but push the movement to continue just to engage people. Like we have to talk to people, and not parachute in. Like the conversations have to happen year round. Folk know that now, right? So there's a willingness for us to figure it out collectively. So just very optimistic at the opportunities of working with a movement and not just one-offs. To really make change. So looking forward to this conversation and the opportunities in front of us.
Candace, you're next.
I want to echo the enthusiasm that Ed brought to this. I think that we made a lot of significant gains in this state, despite the fact that we were contending with COVID-19, and we were a part of the party that was acknowledging its existence and its potential danger to our voters, its potential danger to our candidates. And I am absolutely excited about a lot of the inroads we've made with democratic infrastructure here. Before I was Vote Mama's Texas chair, I was a Democratic nominee for Congress in Texas's 24th district. And my race was the only race in which a Democrat saw percentage vote share increase for a Democrat in the entire state. I got within 1.3 points. And that happened because there was a large amount of investment, not just from folks who wanted to see that infrastructure built out from out of state, but people here were bought in. And it was very difficult for a lot of families to make things work when they lost childcare, when they lost their jobs, to continue to do the work here. As we haven't had democratic infrastructure, it's been hollowed out over the last couple of decades. And I am so glad that Ray, you got trained in 2014 and you've stuck it out with your state for a long time. But we want to see more Rays. We want to train a lot more young people, a lot more people of color, so that they are knocking on doors, so that they are organizing their own communities, so that we can see those electoral gains that we saw in Georgia. And I think that if we continue this investment, if we get vaccinated, we should see incredible gains over the next couple of years.
Sweet. And Kendall, you're our last one.
Thanks, James. I'm afraid I'm the wet blanket here because I don't share the same level of optimism as other folks, but I do think that Texas could get there if we refuse to sit around and wait for demographics to become destiny. I mean, people talk a lot about how big Texas is, but what they don't talk about is the fact that there are 40 mid-sized cities in the state of Texas that have over 100,000 people in them. Now, in any other state, that would be your population centers. But here in Texas, we don't even talk to those people. We don't put organizers there. We don't do work in those communities. And that's a real problem. If we're not talking about organizing, the Tylers, the Nacogdocheses, the Lubbocks, the Amarillas of the world, then we're going to have a real problem moving down the road. I think Texas can flip sooner if we put in the work in places like that. Where I start to get worried is I look at places like Nacogdoches and Amarillo that both went blue in the last election, but we still don't have organizers on the ground there. And until people wake up and realize that this isn't an 8-city strategy in this state, it's a plan where we have got to get on the ground in communities that are regularly getting neglected by our party apparatus. And we need to get in there and show them that we are connected to those communities, because just as African Americans and Hispanic voters aren't monoliths, rural communities aren't monoliths either. And just as when we go into Black communities, we talk to them about criminal justice reform. When we go to Hispanic communities, we talk to them about immigration reform. When we go into rural communities, we talk to them about farms. Well, those people care about more issues than just that. And we have to start talking to voters like they're people. And I think that that's how we're going to start to see progress in the state. And I think it can happen a lot sooner than other people think.
Well, let's talk to a candidate who saw it on the ground. And that candidate is, well, actually, a lot of you ran for office before, but I'm first going to talk to Candace. Sorry, everyone. Candace, you're an Afro-Latina woman, ran for Congress, aimed to flip a seat in North Texas, 24th District. You talked all about this. You were endorsed by President Obama, and your seat kept seeing the margins between Democrats and Republicans narrow. Even Beto O'Rourke carrying it by like 3.5%, I believe, in 2018. But like in a lot of other states, there seems to be a disconnect between Black and brown progressive communities. Do you think so? And if so, how do you think Democrats can work to bridge that disconnect?
I will now echo Kendall in saying that we aren't monoliths, right? So when we are talking to Black and Latino communities, when you're looking at your suburban communities, you're going to be talking about a lot of the same issues that you would be talking to white folks about, maybe with a better lens to equity. So when we're talking about police reform, everybody cares about whether our police are working for our people, about whether or not they are serving and protecting absolutely everybody. When we're talking about education, everybody wants to see that their kids are succeeding. Everyone wants to see that they're getting paid what they deserve to get paid for the work that they turn out. So not seeing those folks as monoliths is an important and critical step. But the other part, and I think that this is where a lot of our national organizations might have lost step. We talked a lot about Texas being this young, vibrant, growing minority state, right? But when it came to turnout tactics, they fell back to a lot of talking to reliable voters. And you saw folks churning through universes where these voters might have traditionally been Republicans because they took for granted some of their newly registered voters. And if we look at the thing that happened in Georgia, it was because Stacey Abrams and the beautiful and broad coalition she built didn't just register folks to vote and said, okay, y'all are brown, you're going to be here on election day, I'll see you later. They engaged them in the process. They brought them along. They talked to them about the importance of voting and when to vote and where to vote, because they were facing what we're facing here, a lot of voter suppression, a lot of misinformation, a lot of lack of information. And we need to be that methodical with our newly registered voters if we want to see that go forward. And I think that we have got some groundwork going right now, but we have to build it.
Next, we're going to jump to Amanda, who ran, as she said, for US Senate. And kind of on the same topic, Amanda, I think it's been outlined that we're a very interesting state demographically. But the Houston area where you come from, even though a lot of people are like, oh, Houston, one of the largest cities in the nation, totally different from Texas. Its demographics actually reflect Texas. So I guess in your experience as a candidate, as an activist, who's the Democratic coalition in the state? And how do they differentiate the ways they need to message and get to these other groups?
I think what we have to do is listen to the needs of the people. I think oftentimes we have a disconnect between what I call, it's governance and campaigning. And they're, quite frankly, having that disconnect is part of the problem, because we don't see those two as something that should be synced up and in tandem. What you see is that people go around and they have talking points on a campaign trail, talking to residents, going out into communities of color, talking to young people about what matters to them. But then on the accountability side, once you win that election, we don't connect the dots. We're not actually then saying, well, how did I do? Did I get an A? Did I do the things that I said I was going to do on the campaign trail? And what happens is, as a result of having that disconnect and saying, oh, well, first you got to get elected, because that's oftentimes what people say. But then once you have that disconnect, when you come back around that next time and you didn't do the things for that person's life that would make a difference in their lives, then they're disconnected from voting. And so I think we look at the constituency whom we are elected to serve, young, old, people of color, women, men, but look at all those demographics, but make promises that we actually keep. And then those individuals will then be able to be that messenger for you, because they are the proof in the pudding, right? They're the proof of concept, in the sense that they then can say, my vote actually did matter this time, as opposed to feeling like they've been manipulated or used in a process that doesn't really work for them. And so I think we need to think differently about constituencies and really think about how effective we are as leaders, and then uplift those voices whom we've served effectively when it's time for the next election, because then that means democracy actually works and there is an end product for you. And I think that's a different way of thinking about it. But it's certainly one that's really important, because a lot of people get disconnected when you're trying to motivate voters and you're trying to motivate people to do something that they otherwise might not. They have to understand and believe that it really will make a difference in their lives. So to the extent you can have that messaging, I think that will be one of the most effective things that we haven't used, but should be using well. And that's when democracy actually works.
Sweet, thanks. Kendall, I want you to actually talk a little bit more about rural Texas as not the monolith, whether it's not just like, the view that it's a bunch of conservative old white people, for instance, which is definitely not the case in my experience. And kind of the outreach and strategy would suggest to national groups there.
Well, look, when I ran for Senate, my district was largely rural, and we didn't win it. Overperformed Hillary by about 22 points, though. And I think that when we show up in those communities and we meet people and we talk to them, we make a much bigger impact than whenever we just ignore them and hope that they're in the right media markets when we're spending money in Dallas and Houston. And I think that that's kind of been the strategy out there. Look, we get our asses kicked in rural Texas, and we deserve it. And I think part of that is that we don't visit them. And another part of that is that we think that they're all a bunch of white folks. But outside of large cities like Dallas and Houston, there are huge African-American populations in East Texas, right? When's the last time that we sent organizers to churches and to community picnics and things in Longview, Texas, or in Marshall, and started registering voters, or register them in Paris or Texarkana? We just don't do it. And what happens is, to us, when we say rural, you assume that we're talking about some 2-horse town with 50 people in it. But to Texas, what rural means are towns that have 100,000 people in them. I mean, it's not like they're places that you're wasting your time by putting resources out there. You can mine votes out there. You can really have a lot of work to do there. We're not asking people to spend money in, Rusk, Texas over Dallas, Texas, but we are saying spend some money in Tyler, Texas instead of spending it in Garland, Texas, right? Like there are so many areas of Texas that we just haven't sent our message to, and they don't recognize us. They don't know who we are. When I'd stick my pickup truck inside of a parade with the donkey flag on the back of it, I mean, my truck would get keyed and people lose their mind. They're like, what do you mean you're a Democrat? You're such a nice person. I'm like, yeah, most of us are. You should take some time to get to know us. Oh, wait, you don't know any of us because we haven't come out there to meet you. And so, I think we've got a lot of work to do to spend time out there. You saw what happens when you talk to people in those areas. In Beto O'Rourke's numbers, when Beto got within 3 points, he spent time in these areas. I spent time in my district with him, and we've got to do more of that, and not just expect areas of Dallas and suburbia and Houston to carry us across the finish line.
So let's talk messaging. This is for Ed and Candace, ideally, but if someone has a thought that they want to keep within 2 minutes, of course, definitely jump in. So the Democratic Party has this debate where it's like Republicans really know how to pack a punch with one line and a bumper sticker, and Democrats kind of get into convoluted intellectual arguments. Was any of that in play in 2020? I do want to start with Candace and Ed, but if anyone has some wisdom, shoot it my way.
Was it in play in 2020? It's in play every election cycle. Democrats love to explain things. If I could only explain, people will come around. It's a constant effort to get better at messaging. Having said that, I do think that Democrats, progressives, and with the help of organizations like Progress Texas, have gotten better at messaging and more disciplined at it as well. So yeah, I think that can help. And it's not a matter of whether or not you're going to have a progressive message or a moderate message. The point is you can't have one or the other. You got to do both. There is no blanket for your audiences. There's no blanket message. Different people are going to respond to different things, and that's okay. We just have to be able to acknowledge that. One of the things that we have going for us that I like to talk about here in Texas is that progressive values are mainstream values. And even in Texas, when you go around and you ask people if they believe in climate change, if they want to protect voting rights, if they want to protect abortion rights, if they want to protect the environment, if they want gun safety, all of those have a majority of support in Texas. I know it's hard to believe because some of the folklore leads us to believe that it's not the case, but it actually is. And those are progressive issues. And if they should be mainstream issues, that progressives shouldn't have we shouldn't have a monopoly on those issues because they should be ones that everyone agrees on. But if they're branded as progressive issues, I'm okay with that.
And I'll add to that and say that there is this misconception that when we think of Democrats in Texas, or when we think about Democrats in any red state, we think of them as being in some sort of mushy middle. And I think it's a lot more complex than that. Mm-hmm. And I had the opportunity to get to really talk to folks when I was running for school board. I got to really get into communities in the way that fostered a sort of intimacy. And I was able to talk to folks who believe that you should be paying a living wage, folks that believe that healthcare should be available to everyone, but also would like to see sensible gun laws and would like to keep their guns safely stored in their homes. And when you try to create this national narrative and you try to put your preconceived notions onto a Texas Democrat, well, Texas, as it was hit home earlier on by the national folks, and they did an absolutely amazing job at describing the situation. Texas is huge. The regional differences are huge. A Latino in Brownsville, a Latino in El Paso, and a Latino in Dallas are going to have very different views on hot sauce. So we're not going to really come together on absolutely every issue. And so when we start to look at these communities of color and all of our communities, not as monoliths, but as folks in need of a good representation, then our messaging is going to come from a genuine place and people are going to sense and vote for that.
So to Ray, who gets the youth vote out and is clearly like the model of this starting in 2014, Jesus. What was like the youth enthusiasm you saw, like this cycle? And do you think organizations can do a lot better to reach out to youth?
Yeah, so one of the cool things that we saw in the 2020 election was that voters ages 18 to 29 turned out in huge numbers, more than double than the vote in 2016. And also young voters ages 18 to 29 experienced the largest increase in vote share, more than any other age group, from 11.3% in 2016 to 14.2% in 2020. That is really exciting. That is just showing how young people are registering to vote, are voting. They care about, who reflects them in office. They want to see those people actually legislate to the things that their communities need, and they're not seeing that right now. So I think that we're going to continue to see the youth vote share continue to rise as we go on. And then I also think that we've started to see more investment in organizations who invest in young people of color, but we can continue to see more. And the best way, to increase that youth vote is by investing in young people of color. So making sure young people of color get paid jobs to organize in their communities, and making sure that if maybe a person can't do a paid organizing job, maybe they can get a stipend and come work with you a couple of hours a week. So making sure that we're making room for young people, we're training young people, we're welcoming them in. We're not turning them away, saying, putting them into organizing other kind of constituencies, like allowing young people to talk to young people and make sure that we're growing that vote share is really important. And we can continue to see more organizations do it, although there have been a lot of changes that a lot of organizations have made to make sure that they're including youth voices.
So this is for Travis, and I'm so excited to finally get to ask you this big question that, especially as Ray conveniently kind of moved it into. You're working on the fight for $15 minimum wage, and it's a progressive policy idea according to opponents, but it's actually, according to polling, very popular across the spectrum. So how can the left or even progressives speak to voters about platform issues like that one and ensure that they know how to elect candidates who support these policies if they want to become law? Your mic is off. As much as I like talking.
Sorry, I was so excited to say I really appreciate what Ray was saying, and thanks for the question. You're right. So we saw last year that folks around the country voted for 15. Folks that ran for office, almost guaranteed that 15 will be passed some way, somehow. So I think there's two things. One, we need to elect more honest politicians, right? Like folks that have to do what they say they're going to do, and when they don't, hold them accountable. I think folks have got very comfortable telling us what we want to hear, and then there's no repercussions when it doesn't happen, right? So one thing I would say is we have to put more dynamic, real, honest candidates in front of people, and support them in doing that. We have to talk to people. One thing we found when we talked to people about 15 and polling and canvassing, that wasn't their main issue. Like we talked to fast food workers, 15 wasn't always the main issue. They wanted to have their voices heard. Like they want to have dignity in their work. So we have to first talk to folk, right? But when they promise stuff, we have to hold them to it. And those that tell us to our face that they're not going to do it, we have to remove them. The minimum wage hasn't changed in years, right? Like 15 is not a livable wage in a lot of places. So I just think the accountability piece is very important. You know, if you're going to say you're going to make changes in our lives, and we've gone to the ballot box during the pandemic, then you should be held accountable when you go against your word, right? So I just think it's getting the best candidates in front of us, and then holding folk that blatantly lie to us about 15 and many other things, make sure they're held accountable when they don't hold up the end of the deal.
Sweet. And that's why we have this question for all of our fiery former and perhaps future candidates about Democrats. Are they doing a good job at not just working with and messaging to young people, but also like recruiting candidates? I guess this could go to Candace or Kendall or Amanda. It can't go to me. I've never run for office. Who wants to go first?
I think in my race, I got into a very congested, what ended up being a very congested race. I think that we tend to have a construct of what a fill in the blank looks like, in terms of whatever that particular office is. And we've got to really stop tying ourselves to this notion of what has been. If you want the same results, then keep doing the same things. And so you really need to look at people who can deliver results and speak a different language, but one that can have a demonstrated track record. So for me, when I ran for office, yes, I was a lot younger than most, especially for a US Senate race, but I had experience directly with constituents. I had been effective as an at-large city council member covering 2.3 million constituents effectively, understood the rigors of fundraising and all of the things that become important. But most importantly, I understood how people were feeling, and I think an ability to connect and be honest and have values that get people away from the frustration they feel about politics as usual is critical. I think people are tired of politics as usual. They're tired of you finding their house when it's campaign season, but you don't go looking for their house after the disaster. They're tired of you knowing what their name is and what their phone number is for your purposes, but when they knock on your door or ring your phone or send you an email in your office, you are nowhere to be found. That paradigm doesn't work for people. And so we've got to be seeking out candidates that are interested in a paradigm that's customer service oriented, that's people focused, and that embraces some innovation. Some things are longstanding problems that just need a new lens in terms of the way you look at it or approach it. Others are new issues that emerge either as problems or opportunities, and you've got to put leaders in place that know how to seize that. So do I mean that just because you might be younger in age that it means inexperienced in terms of leadership? No, I think we've got to get people who have experience with leadership, but who also can do some things differently so that we can get some different results. And I think that is what we should lead with when we're looking at different types of candidates that don't fit the typical schema of what one might imagine.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of what Amanda said, I've been on the receiving end of this candidate recruitment situation. Whenever I decided to step up and run for Senate, I was the first millennial to be nominated for the Texas Senate, and I ran whenever I was 28 years old. Actually, when I announced I was 26, and it was a 2-year campaign. And whenever I announced I was going to run, there was a bunch of people at the party that came to me and tried to convince me to drop out because they thought I was too young, and they said that I didn't match the district like I should. And I told them I was going to do it whether they wanted to or not. You can either work with me or we can fight it out in the primary. And I ended up being unopposed in the primary. And so we ended up overperforming better work in the district. And I did really well. And there was a down ballot effect in my race. And that was despite the fact that people just didn't see that young people were the solution in that district. And so I think that that's largely the case a lot of places. I think more young people need to step up to run, but understand that there are different barriers to young people running than there are for other folks. We don't have the fat Rolodexes that other folks do. We don't have the decades and decades of experience on working on a bunch of these races, which I think is a good thing. It brings us outside of our boxes. But I think you solve that candidate recruitment problem by pulling more young people in to run.
The thing I think that gets forgotten when recruiting for office is that it shouldn't matter how competitive a district is or not, because the bottom line is that voters deserve good candidates, and they deserve to have good people run. They deserve to have the right to pick between two good candidates. Now, if it's a gerrymandered district that's lopsided one way or another, they still deserve to have somebody who's out there making a concerted effort to get out their message. And you see it in local elections quite a bit, where they don't have the partisan letter after their name. You know, Amanda talked about it, what it was like to run citywide in Houston. You see it here in Austin. The conventional wisdom of who should be on city council is rarely what the voters actually decide at the end. You see it in other places too. So I think that, you know, if you're really passionate and you really believe in it and you're authentic about what you want to do, you should run. And the party can recruit you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that who they recruit is going to be the best person for the job. If you really believe in it, you should do it.
It's great to have a party that is actively trying to set up the kind of infrastructure necessary to expand, to grow, to be more representative. But I feel the perception, and I heard Amanda talking about it, the perceptions of what a candidate should look like, what a candidate should look like in Texas may not necessarily be what people see in themselves, what people see as a representative of their day-to-day lives, of the things that they need delivered to them. And, you know, in my case, I was definitely not someone that was highly recruited or highly sought after, despite the fact that when I first started, I was the only person who was elected in my district. I defeated an 18-year incumbent with a backing of the Republican establishment to get on my school board. Folks were still asking, well, are you electable? Do you have the right sort of experience? And that just goes to show that you really need to look at the community and the needs that they need to have met. You need to look at the person and ask if they're willing not just to put their face on a flyer, but are they willing to do the work? Are they willing to govern even when it sucks? And there's a lot of times that you're there and you're asked to make a lot of decisions that most folks don't want to make. That's why you're elected to do it. And oftentimes when folks recruit with just is this a look of a candidate in mind, you don't get sustainable results. You don't get the kind of governance that lasts. And that is ultimately what we should be aiming for.
Hey, Kendall, sorry, I got really moved by that, y'all. I'm so glad that I asked that of each of you. Thank you for bringing such insight. I guess that's why you're here. But so, Kendall, to the point, and not to traumatize everyone, but maybe you remember there was this big storm in February. Maybe you remember that according to recent reports, it killed 111 people. There are still some places in the state where people do not have power or water. That's also the fact that we're still in the middle of a pandemic. A lot of us have lost our jobs, yet Ted Cruz decided to go to Cancun. Ken Paxton decided to go to Utah. Republicans and Democrats were able to kind of find a common enemy in an outdated grid, but Republicans were also still able to push a lot of the blame on renewable energy. Now, to be clear, while this has been a big sounding board, there have also been other people blamed. And maybe we'll see in the midterms if this becomes a substantive issue. But do you think Democrats can get a clear message together about how this crisis came to be and how they can pivot it to blame Republicans?
James, I love this question. Messaging is really hard for Democrats because of what we love about our party, right? Republicans are all a bunch of old bootlicking white dudes. And so it's really easy to have one message that sticks with all of them and it resonates well, but we have a very diverse party and that's what we love about it. But as a result, it makes it hard to message because you can't just do one underlying argument. We end up trying to expand and explain things. But we need to start, in my opinion, hitting people in their gut and going with what what you feel and less about what you think. Like when a 12-year-old boy died trying to keep his 8-year-old brother warm, and then 2 weeks later, Greg Abbott lists a mask ordinance and we've already seen a COVID rise. Every Democrat should have been on that news asking Greg Abbott, Greg, haven't you killed enough Texans this month? But they weren't doing it. They were trying to argue about the efficacies of vaccines and masks and how important it is. And all of that's great. But the people that are going to be persuaded by that have already sought that information out. They've already been persuaded about it. And we've got to hit people with their morals and their values and what drives them. And as Texans, we shouldn't be okay with elected leaders that think it's okay to watch us die while they're in their hotel suite in Cancun. And we have to speak to that and less about these random factoid details that, yeah, they're really important when you're legislating, but that's not how people make decisions when they vote. They make decisions based on what impacts them, their values, and their families. And we don't spend enough time talking about that in ways that translates, in my opinion.
You know, a few feet from where I'm sitting right now, I was snuggled up with my 2-year-old in a house that was under 50 degrees. And I was worried about whether we would survive. And that's something that's going to stick with me. And I think that's going to stick with a lot of Texans, but the Texans that were disproportionately affected by this tragic, this negligence, this oversight, this murder, are the folks that are most likely to be disenfranchised. Those are the folks that are most likely to be pushed away from the polls. And so if we want to make sure that we get folks the kind of representation they need after experiencing what we experienced during that storm, then we need to make sure that we are methodical, that we are obsessive about getting folks registered and then bringing folks along this process, because they're very busy trying to survive COVID-19 and everything else our terrible Republican government is going to throw at them. It's very, very hard to keep focused on something like this when it just doesn't stop coming.
So in the event that, wait, sorry, was somebody saying something?
I was just getting ready to add to just the issue.
Sorry,
I mean,
I didn't see you. That's my fault.
it's okay. It's okay. You know, immediately after, in the aftermath of the energy grid failure, you know, folks like Beto and others, we're going around raising money, trying to get support for people and checking in with them. I started doing phone banking for seniors. I've been doing food and water drops for our homebound seniors who can't get to these drive-in water distribution sites and other things that people are doing. And I still have, you know, I give my personal cell phone number out to a number of them. And I had a 93-year-old call me today. I still have people in need. I'm trying to get somebody in emergency temporary housing right now as we speak, because they're in hazardous conditions. The monies that are philanthropic dollars are limited in what they could be used to pay for, but yet they're still living in these conditions. And in each instance, the 93-year-old, the example of the gentleman who is in a home that is in total disrepair, hole in the wall, and all kinds of other circumstances, none of them called me. And you have to think about that for just a moment. People are suffering in silence, and they're so used to or so accustomed to suffering in silence that they don't even amplify their voices to ask for help oftentimes. And so for those people, as Democrats, as people who are seeking elective office, we have to be the voice for those people and not stand or tolerate someone going on vacation to Cancun while people are facing death and devastation in this way. And so I would hope that we lead not just of a message with the message of the lack of preparation, the reckless indifference for human life, but we also lead with the responsibility that our people deserve better than that. An 83-year-old should not be in those conditions. A 93-year-old should not be calling my phone about food and water. And that's the condition that our elected officials have put the people of Texas in, and we should carry their stories forward as we advocate for change. And so I say lead with the people because they are the ones that were harmed.
So this is then a question for Ray, because it's about the people. And then there's a follow-up for Amanda. So it's about the voting process, fueled by the people. And this is a panel also about if Texas is the next Georgia. Well, conveniently, Georgia, recently passed that expansive election reform bill. And Texas, as you know very well, Ray, having been now at the Capitol for probably 24 hours, there have been hot debates on two big omnibus election bills, many of which opponents argue restrict access at the ballot, from people with disabilities to people of color, to just limiting elections administrators' abilities to conduct elections as they have in past elections. Do you think SB 7, which has passed out of the Senate, and HB 6, which is currently being debated in the committee, that they ultimately will pass? And then Amanda, if they do pass, how do people fight back?
So to give a little background for folks, SB 7 and HB 6, as James said, if passed, they will both criminalize voters and good folks who are trying to assist voters. They will, put undue burdens on voter registrars trying to conduct just the regular process of making sure that people have an avenue to get engaged in, their voting and their community. So, this will hurt folks of color. This will hurt working people. We saw a lot of counties distribute vote by mail applications, send it proactively, because we are in a pandemic right now. And in 2020, we were in a pandemic. So folks proactively sent out vote by mail applications, making sure that people had that access in case they felt uncomfortable going out. We had, counties expand polling hours and drive-through polling, they expanded polling hours, and then made made drive-through polling locations, which made it really easy for voters to access and get in and get out, with really lowered fears of coming into contact with folks and the possibly contracting the virus from interacting with folks out in public. So yes, these two bills are awful, bad bills. We do have a majority Republican House and Senate. There is some concern that these bills will pass, and I think legitimate concern. Folks are right now at the Capitol trying to make sure that their voices are heard, that these, HB 6 does not pass, and that SB 7 does not get through the House. So we're trying as hard as we can to make sure that these bills do not end up passing. But I think that, there's a legitimate concern that they may pass out of the House and Senate.
Then Amanda, give me your best.
I mean, if they do pass, I think it's contingent upon us to go back and undo the damage that is being done. We have to educate people about the changes. That's our responsibility, but then we have to mobilize to get the change that we deserve. I mean, voter suppression is nothing new. From poll taxes to several different literacy tests, you name it. This is a tactic that has been utilized over time to suppress people's voices and oppress them with the policies that result from that. So there is obviously a long-term game in this, and this is not something that we have, can't fight or will not fight. We have to fight. But in the meantime, as these issues do arise, we have to make sure that people are aware of the changes. That's also, if last year you went to the poll, one year you go to the polling site and you could do X and Y and Z, and then you expect the same the following time, because I don't know, maybe that was, something, a reasonable thing to expect in terms of if your government wanted you to actually participate. Then you come back and they say, no, you can't vote that way, or we are not allowing that. We've got to educate people, because some people will get discouraged by that. They will say, oh, well, I tried. Or maybe it's not even a matter of discouragement. It could be a logistical challenge. If you reduce the hours in which somebody who is a wage earning worker can go to the polls, or if they are not, consistent with shift work, you reduce the amount of people who have access to the polls. So we should be advocating not just for the reversal of those state law changes that are taking place and are likely to occur, but we should also be advocating for Election Day to be a holiday. I mean, it's unbelievable to me that it seems so simple, but the basis for which is so clear, that the end of the day, this is about power instead of people. And that's why it's so important that we put people who will put the people first in office. And so these are all tactics that can be fought and should be fought. But in the meantime, education is going to be so important, because we cannot afford to have people get discouraged, get turned away. We have to be vigilant about the status quo if this change, in fact, does result. We should be fighting this change. We should be fighting this. With the hearings that took place and people being turned away from being able to speak, there's all kind of gamemanship at bay here. So at play here. So we've got to make sure that we're ready, prepared, and we'll fight. And even if we are not successful in this particular fight, that we educate people about how to go about voting, because then we need to vote these folks out of office who passed this law in the first place, if it in fact passes.
So, Travis, hey, speaking of obstacles in your field, Texas is a right to work state. How has that, if at all, affected labor's ability to organize here?
Affected it tremendously, right? Our opposition will regularly find ways to make things difficult for us. I think what's changing now are working people are paying more attention, right? So people now, union at one point was kind of a dirty word. So now we talk about worker organization. Folk, whether you're a middle class worker, a non-worker, people now understand or better understand the need for representation against these large corporations, right? So I think there's been a shift in how folk think about it. Folk are more willing to fight for it. Fortunately, this administration has talked more pro-union, right? So it's given people more hope that we can actually get some type of change. But it's hard. People are scared, right? Especially in places like Texas, right? To go up against their boss. So it's provided a lot of challenges, but the evolution of the movement is helping us get labor unions or work organizations back into the mainstream. So just once again, making the change at the ballot is what's very important, right? We have to elect people that understand that being able to organize should be a right, and is the way to build a middle class again. So I've seen the evolution of how we've talked about right to work, and there is more optimism that stuff can happen, but it's extremely hard, to be totally honest.
I guess when this is for Ed, and then if anybody else wants to chime in and wants to stay within 2 minutes, of course. As you can see, I'm a serial enforcer. I want to talk about what could be very difficult for Democrats in 2022 and 2024. And Ed, because presidential and midterm elections are very different things, what are you anticipating for 2022 first, then 2024?
Well, before we could even get to the midterms, what we have to think about is redistricting, which is going to be a huge battle this fall. The legislature will go into a special session because they're not even going to get the census data until September 30th, which means they can't start drawing maps until after that. So that's going to be the first thing. And look, we don't have the numbers. So the two things that are going to be able to influence redistricting are the courts or Republicans themselves. Do they want to give up 57, 58% districts in favor of having 51 and 52% districts? I don't think they will, but they'll still find a way to slice and dice things up. So that's the first hurdle. Second to that, how can we perform in midterms? Look, you're already seeing the art of the illusion, the distracting and misinformation that Republicans have learned from Donald Trump. You mentioned it a minute ago. We had this huge winter storm, yet here we are talking about voting rights and abortion rights, which are things that voters are not even asking the legislature to work on. If Democrats can take back the narrative and bring it back to what matters, messaging is math. Messaging is math. If you know that message to the people that you need to mobilize and you get them out, then you should be able to have an advantage. Now, again, redistricting plays into that. I want to go back to something else I said earlier about having good candidates. We've got to have good candidates run statewide, candidates like Amanda Edwards who've run before, people like Candace Valenzuela, even you, Kendall Scudder. We need people out there running again. We need people who can keep running and just go out with the courage of their convictions and make the case to the people. Nobody gave Beto O'Rourke a chance. They said he was an unknown candidate from El Paso, and he raised a ton of money and came closer than anybody has in a long time. Look, he didn't get there, but he was a big part of not just what happened in 2018, but what started in 2016 and what continued into 2020. Remember, we maybe didn't pick up seats, but we held the line in 2020. That's how I see 2022 going. We can't give up the fight. We have to keep going. And really the only way we're going to make any progress in this state is if we do keep going.
I want to also use this as an opportunity that with some of the former candidates here, if they want to make any special announcements now, just bring it on. Uh-oh.
No, it's perfect it's perfect to announce something on April Fools. Absolutely.
We're all buying the Fort Worth Weekly.
Now, you are doing that despite it being April Fool's Day.
No.
Does anybody else have any thoughts on that? Because if not, that's cool.
Aligned with what Ed has to say, this is kind of a fun, I'll keep it quick, but I broke my collarbone back in February. I fell down a mountain when I was skiing, and I didn't want the paramedics called because I was just, what a nightmare. And I just skied down with a broken collarbone. And when I got into the ER, the doctor looked at me and was like, how did you do that? Like, how'd you get out? I was like, it's hard to knock me down. I'm a Texas Democrat. Because there are so many of us that have been doing this for so long. And we're so used to just getting kicked in the stomach every election that if you're picking a state where your Democrats are going to get up and keep fighting, it's going to be Texas. So don't expect anybody on this call or any Texas organizers here for Democrats to back down. I think 22 is going to be a knockdown, drag out fight. I think we have some chances to win it. And if we lose it, 2024 is going to be a knockdown, drag out fight because that's what we do. We don't step back very long. And on the topic of Republicans, we have a saying where any jackass can kick down a barn, but it takes a carpenter to build one. That's the problem with Republicans. They never come to the table with solutions. And when they come to the table with these voter problems or whatever, what a normal party, if they were real concerns, would have is say, here are some solutions to those problems. But that's not what they're doing. They are overtly trying to stop people from voting. And that's how we know that they are not serious about governing. Whenever Democrats were in control of this state had the best roads in the country. We had some of the best schools in the world. We had some of the best hospitals in the country. And then last month, after Republicans have been in control for 20 years, we couldn't even turn our light switches on or drink water out of our faucets. So I think that that's the message that we're going to be running on for the next few years. And I hope that it resonates because I think a lot of us were sitting in dark apartments and houses for a week trying to figure out if we were going to starve to death or not. And that's probably going to be the message that's going to resonate. And I think you can count on Texas Democrats to keep fighting to send that message across the finish line.
Republicans like to say that government doesn't work. And then here in Texas, they go on and get elected so they can prove it. And that's just one of the things that we have been dealing with here. But the last thing I want to say, and I think that Travis and Ray and myself at Progress Texas, between the unions and Texas Freedom Network, we recognize that campaigns come and go, but the permanent infrastructure to keep these things going is what is going to make the change here. And that democracy is like a muscle, and elections can't be the beginning and the end of your activism. It has to continue through the legislative session, through your local city councils, and everything in between. And demographics are not destiny. Demographics have never been destiny. Demographics are an opportunity. And the opportunity comes if we put in the work and develop the relationships to get ourselves where we're going. And again, make sure that we have the message.
So piggybacking on that, each of you gets 30 seconds just to say what you're going to do between now and 2022 to advance your causes, to advance your definition, the cause, you know what I'm saying. So I'm just gonna start. I'm just Travis, go, 30 seconds.
And I don't need the whole 30. I am going to help us, and us being the SEIU, figure out how we support this movement on the ground in Texas. Like our leaders there are asking for more from me, particularly on how we work with folks. So just really looking forward to leaning in and hopefully affecting some change.
Ray, anything you're gonna do differently?
I don't know about differently, but we're going to continue to invest in young people of color, build strong leaders that can continue to organize years long, and register hundreds of voters.
Kendall, you differently.
We're going to go into traditionally overlooked areas of this state and recruit quality candidates that are from those communities to run for state legislative races, for down ballot seats. And we're going to try to come in and fund them in large ways. And that's what we're trying to do with Represent Texas. We're going to lose a lot of races, but that's the point. We're going to move the needles to a point where we're going to be able to be competitive statewide.
Candace.
I'm investing my time, my talent, my treasure in progressive municipal candidates. And as soon as May 1st is over, I'm going to be investing my time, my talent, my treasure, everything that I have in getting folks registered to vote and investing in more campaign staff that look like Ray. Ray is definitely going to be the future of what our staff here are in Texas. And we'll advance if we just keep building that infrastructure, keep maintaining it.
And then Amanda.
Well, I certainly will need to practice what I preach and deliver on results. I'm no longer in public office because of the race, but I am focused on empowering communities with my new nonprofit, Be the Solution Community Empowerment Organization. We are equipping people with information that they need. We're equipping them with the tools that are helpful to them to really be the voice of change and to be the change in their respective communities. So we focus a lot on seniors, and we're going to continue to do that work. We are brothers and sisters keepers, and I seek to use that organization as a means of making sure that we protect and uplift them and empower them to do the same for others.
And Ed, you're the only one left.
I'll bring it home. So Progress Texas focuses on rapid response media and message development for the progressive movement. We will keep doing that to help amplify messages of organizations and candidates, former candidates and future candidates like the ones here. And we will keep uplifting those voices. We have got to look like the people that we're fighting for, and we have got to have good, compelling messages through the airwaves. We're going to keep doing that.
Thanks, y'all. And I really can't thank you enough that through the everything we've gone through in Texas the past couple of months, that you were still able to find time to do this. This is an incredibly important discussion. That's why y'all are involved. And I just hope that our viewers take away and are kind of inspired. And maybe if any of y'all run, throw some money at you too. And I'm going to turn it back over to Andy Pringle. March on.
Yes, James, thank you so much for leading this wonderful discussion. I want to thank the panelists. I mean, it's such an amazing panel, and Texas is such an important state to us. Travis, my brother, and Ed, my old friend, and Amanda, half my team, my political team, has worked for you. So all of this has been an amazing experience here today. Midterms are just 18 months away, so you know we're ready to support you, Texas, and we're going to do everything we can to help you make a win happen there. This marks the end of our Pushing for Progress panel series. To catch up with these insightful conversations and learn real actionable tips from the organizers in Georgia, Florida, and Texas, visit wearemarchon.org/PFP to watch all 3 panels. In the meantime, sign the pledge to register voters at wearemarchon.org/pledge. Good night, everyone, and thank you.